They say a man built this church with his own bleeding hands as penance for murdering his brother. Every part of that is false, and the reason someone invented it is stranger than a murder. High above a small German town, wedged into a hollow in a sheer cliff, there is a church that should not be there. Its pale walls rise straight out of the rock. Behind its altar there is no wall at all, only the mountain itself. A castle looms above it. A long drop falls away below it, and water seeps endlessly from a spring inside the stone. To reach it, you climb through a tunnel cut into the mountain and up more than 200 steps into the dark until the passage opens into a Gothic sanctuary pressed against the living rock. It is called the Felsenkirche, the church in the rock. And the most famous story ever told about it begins with a murder. They say it was built by a man who killed his own brother. 2 brothers lived in the castle on the cliff. Virich the elder, proud, serious, quick to anger, and Emich the younger, easier, gentler, the one people loved. They had been raised under the same roof, trained with the same weapons, taught to defend the same land, and then they made the oldest mistake in the world. They both fell in love with the same woman. Her name was Bertha, and while Virich was away on family business, certain perhaps that she would one day be his, Emich acted first. He declared his love, won her hand, and arranged the marriage. And when Virich came home, his younger brother met him with the news. The legend is careful on this point. It was not a planned murder. It was a few seconds of uncontrollable rage. The voices rose inside the stone chamber. One brother moved toward the other. The argument carried them towards an open window, high above the cliff, and then Virich pushed. Emich went over the ledge and struck the rocks below, and came to rest in the hollow at the foot of the castle, the exact place where the church now stands. By the time Virich reached the window and looked down, the rage was already gone, and so was his brother. What followed, the story says, was a guilt that no distance could outrun. Virich left the castle. He wandered. Some versions sent him on a crusade to the Holy Land, hoping that war and prayer might quiet his conscience. Nothing worked. Wherever he went, the cliff went with him. At last, he confessed the murder to an abbot, expecting condemnation. Instead, the abbot gave him a penance stranger than any punishment. He was to return to the very spot where his brother had died, and there, with his own hands, cut a church out of the mountain. Every blow of the hammer would be a prayer. Every piece of rock he tore from the cliff would be a fragment of his guilt. And only when it was finished might he dare to ask whether he had been forgiven. So Virich went home. And in the hollow beneath the castle, the nobleman, who had once commanded servants, began to carry broken stone with his own bleeding hands. Days became months, months became years. The town watched from below, some pitying him, some certain that no amount of labour could ever wash out a brother's blood. Slowly, the hollow became a church. Walls rose across its open face. Windows opened above the valley. An altar was set in the place where Emich had fallen, and when at last it was finished, Virich knelt before that altar and begged God for a sign, and water began to flow from the rock. A spring opened where there had been solid stone, clear water, seeping out of the mountain. Virich understood. His sin had not been erased, but his repentance had been seen. On the day the church was consecrated, as the candles were lit and the prayers echoed beneath the cliff, Virich collapsed and died, and they buried the murderer beside the brother he had killed, the two of them divided by jealousy in life, reunited at last beneath the church that grief had built. That is the legend, and it is perfect. The castle stands above, the drop falls between, the spring still flows, the church sits exactly where a falling body would have landed. The building seems to confirm the story before you have examined a single fact, but almost none of it is true, and the truth is stranger than the crime. because we know who actually built the Felsenkirche. His name really was Virich IV of Down-Oberstein, and he was no tormented fratricide wandering the earth in guilt. He was born in 1418. He was one of the wealthiest and most respected nobles of his entire family, trusted by emperors and kings. He married a woman named Margarita in 1440. His daughters became abbesses. One of his sons rose to become the Archbishop of Cologne, and he did not die at the altar of the church he built. He lived on for another 17 years, until 1501. He was not buried beside a murdered brother inside the cliff. He was laid to rest in an abbey miles away, in his mother's family tomb. The real Virich lived too long, married the wrong woman, and was buried in the wrong place to be the murderer in the story. And then there is the single detail that quietly dismantles the whole thing. When Virich endowed this church in 1484, the documents carefully record the names of the adult sons who approved the gift. And one of those sons, one of his living, breathing heirs, standing right there beside him, was named Emich. Emich was not the brother he had murdered. Emich was his son, alive and helping him build the church. So where did the murder come from? Because there was one. Local historians found it, a real killing inside the Oberstein family. But it happened more than 150 years before this church was built, around the year 1328. The victim was a relative, and his name was Virich. But he was not pushed from a castle window by a jealous brother. He was beaten to death in his bed, and his killer was not a brother at all, but a distant cousin from a rival branch of the family, in the middle of a long and bitter dispute over inheritance and land. Now, look at what centuries of retelling did with those pieces. A murdered man named Virich from the 14th century, a church-building man named Virich from the 15th, a killer cousin, a son named Emich, an old fortress on the cliff, a chapel remembered from somewhere down in the valley. Over generations, all of it was slowly crushed together. A cousin became a brother. A beating became a fall. A fight over land became a fight over a woman. And two different men named Virich became one, until the tangled real history of a feuding medieval family collapsed into a single clean story that anyone could remember. Two brothers, one woman, one fall. And we can even watch the folklore drifting. One older version of the tale has no jealous love in it at all. Instead, one brother hides a cat inside the other's boot as a cruel joke. The terrified animal bites him, a quarrel breaks out, and one man throws the other through the window. And that exact story, the cat in the boot, was told at other German castles too. It was a travelling legend, a piece of folklore that wandered from ruin to ruin, borrowing local names wherever it stopped. At Oberstein, it stopped, and it stayed, and the church carved from the mountain by a single grieving man. The mountain itself has an answer to that. If one nobleman had truly hollowed this church out of the cliff by hand, he would have had to remove around 5,000 cubic meters of hard volcanic rock, roughly 12 million kilograms of it. One man, with a chisel. It is simply not possible. And he did not, because the hollow in the cliff was largely already there, a natural cavity, and the oldest walls of the church are not the walls of a church at all. They are nearly 2 meters thick. They have narrow slit openings, like the embrasures of a fortress. They bend at odd defensive angles that no careful church builder would ever choose. What Virich adapted was not raw mountain. It was an abandoned castle, a lower fortress, built into the rock long before, which he converted into a house of God. And the proof is in the calendar. The Pope authorized the new church in August of 1482. It was finished and consecrated by January of 1484, under 17 months. You cannot carve a church out of solid volcanic rock in 17 months, but you can absolutely convert an existing stone fortress into one, and the spring, the miraculous sign of forgiveness, was almost certainly already flowing long before, because a protected water source is exactly why anyone would have built a fortress into that hollow in the first place. The cliff was not chosen because a body had fallen there. It was chosen because medieval Oberstein was crowded against the river, and that sheltered hollow in the rock was one of the only places left to build. So why does the legend refuse to die? Look at what it does. It takes an entire crew of people, the masons, the carpenters, the glaziers, the roofers, the labourers, who actually raised this church against a cliff in under 2 years, and whose names are almost all lost, and it erases them. And in their place it puts one man, one guilty nobleman, whose bleeding hands become the building method, whose suffering becomes the mortar. The harder his penance, the more the church seems to mean. The real Virik left us a very different picture of himself. In a surviving fragment of the church's original stained glass, he had himself shown kneeling, not holding a weapon, not standing over a brother's body, but kneeling quietly as a Christian patron before the sacred. That is how the real builder wanted to be remembered. History records that image, and the legend simply refuses to believe it is the whole story. Because people looked at this church, clinging to a cliff, a dark castle above it, a spring weeping from the rock, and decided that ordinary devotion was not enough to explain it. A place this strange demanded a wound. Stone this dramatic required a sin just as large, and so almost every dramatic detail collapses under examination. The real Virik built the church, but killed no one. The real murder was a cousin, beaten in his bed a century and a half earlier. The hollow was not carved by one man's hands. The spring came before the church, not after. Virik did not die at the altar, and he was not buried beside his victim. And still, none of it matters, because visitors keep climbing through that dark tunnel in the rock, a tunnel that was actually cut in the 1980s, though almost everyone assumes it is medieval, and the guides keep pointing up at the ruined castle, and then down at the church and telling the story. Bertha keeps waiting. Emich keeps falling from the window, and Wisher keeps lifting his hands from the ledge, understanding what he has done, and then, forever, beginning to build. History says this man almost certainly never existed, but the church still stands inside the cliff, and the spring still flows, and that, it turns out, has been enough to keep him alive.